paddock there. So I think again you need to think about some of this as also just a kind of an insurance policy. This isn't too far from there. This is a much better structured soil, a bit safer, but it had been cultivated several times leading up to that January rainfall event. Its structure actually meant that it didn't get vast amounts of gully erosion or sheet erosion. You couldn't see any of it. But what you will see is there's this great beach of sand that's been left as the slope lessened off and the heavier particles have dropped out of solution. And then right at the bottom of the screen there, that's the silt fraction. And then the clay, again, the bit that's probably got, I don't know, half of your nutrients, that kept going, that's gone. That's probably down on the Pittock Rainbow Road in that big pond that's still sitting nearby. So what I see has happened here is that it's actually just washed all of these particles off the outside of the soil aggregates. There was no identifiable large, extensive sort of channels or gullies or anything that have occurred in this paddock. So you might think, oh, well, we got away with it. But this is the paddock as it's establishing now. And those drainage lines have been washed, leached, if you like, of a lot of the nutrients that were in that part of the landscape. So again, if you're trying to optimise your system, potentially that's a lesson on what not to do. Now, I guess the other thing that came out of the water story, because I'm actually all for people running their crop rows in our environment north-south to intercept that westerly erosion wind. But if you're on sloping country and if you get this sort of rainfall events, then you want to think about what we saw. My impression before we got out there was contouring, in effect running crop rows across slope, was probably going to be a good way to kind of take the energy out of the water, disperse it a bit, it'll be fine. But it seems, and I haven't seen enough examples to really sort of hang your hat on it, but it seems that what you've got here is kind of all these little mini dam breaks. You've had breakouts through stubble rows, and it's just gone out in this V shape, and it's scoured a very large area, not to a great depth, but a very large area. And if you consider that probably you're losing your best topsoil first, then I don't know, is that better than something like that? And again, this is in that Pittock Rainbow area, crops running up and down slope. And what we've seen here and the other pictures we took show that effectively what's happened, and at the higher end of the slope where there was less water actually flowing up there, less energy, 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 rows have actually ended up being washed out of the system. And the B horizon of that soil isn't so easily eroded, and what you've got is it looks like someone's gone in there with a laser grader and just thought, oh yeah, I'll put a drain in here. But to me, I think you've probably lost less of your soil resource and less of your nutrients out of the system with this approach. Now, in running a Precision Ag Field Day with Andrew Whitlock, who's with precisionag.com.au, we talked about these examples, and we talked about what they do in higher rainfall subtropical areas in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland. And they're all about taking out, or at least taking much of the height out of check banks that used to be all the rage in that environment. And in fact, they're also looking at running up and down slope. And so I think the theory's changed. About the only caveat to that is, in their landscape, you would end up with a cross drain about every 500 metres if you had a continuing slope that went for longer than that, to take out some of the energy, to intercept some of that water that might end up coming down these sorts of channels. So that's something to think about. And in order to do that, keep in mind that the sort of information you have when you're doing something like yield monitoring, if you've got RTK, quite high precision ag type tracking, then you already have in the logged data in your system, you already have 10 centimetre scale topographic data. You just need a boffin to pull it out and make sense of it for you. And so this is something that Andrew Whitlock provided for me just to illustrate the point. So each of these lines is a 10 centimetre difference in height. I think most CMAs have half a metre at best. So that's something to think about. And I'll just leave you with a couple of points on the screen, and if you've got some questions, happily field those. Yep. No worries.
Questions for Chris? Is there any research on the effect of chemicals on soil health?
I haven't, and I am aware that some of the herbicides and insecticides can have sort of a pretty severe effect on beneficial microbes. Declan might be able to throw something into the mix there, but that's not something I'm really across. I've seen some, I mean, the fungicides that you put on some of the pulses, for instance, and cereals, clearly can knock back some of the beneficial fungi that might free up things like phosphorus in the soil and these sorts of things. But and rhizobia don't react to pretty much any other input that we put in particularly well. So depending on your system, yeah, there's some serious downsides to some of those chemicals. Anything more? I'm hanging around this afternoon.
Yep. A little bit off topic.
Yep.
But a few guys had a burn this year where floods went.
Yep.
In terms of nutrient cycling, how far behind is that going to put us having burn a paddock that hasn't been burnt for, say, good stubble retention for the last 10 years, say?
Yep.
1 year gap, is that going to hurt what we're doing? Or?
Well, I was involved in there was a workshop about soil carbon, this is about 2 years ago now, and we worked out that if you had a soil that was at 1% soil carbon and you were retaining 3 tonne a year of cereal stubble, year on year, with no interruptions, no failures, no burning, after 25 years you might be able to get your soil from 1% to 2% carbon. But one drought, one burning would probably knock you back half of that game in 1 year. So, and as I was talking about before, if you're continually feeding stubble as some form of a slow release fertiliser, it hasn't got the complete gear in it, but it's got good value in it. If you're feeding that in and the plants are taking up the stuff that's being mineralised and freed up again, then if you lose one dose of input, then you will see that, but you might not see it straight away.
So it'll be a delayed sort of effect.
Yep.
Any thoughts on inoculants on the seed or going down the tube?
For pulses.
Yes.
I'm used to working.
Soil health in general, I suppose.
Well, I guess rhizobia. There's a lot of work done, and sort of better people than me to talk about that. But I think in the groupings, there's pretty much, some pretty standard offerings in that regard. I think probably keeping the soil in a better condition for microbes generally might allow those beneficials to persist. There's also, again, I guess, some of the biological inputs that are being marketed, various brews that people are offering to put in. And I guess the serious question is, if these things are beneficial and have been found in our landscape and brewed up by someone who thinks they're onto a good thing, if your soil was going to allow them to persist and thrive, they'd probably be there already. But there's no harm running the sort of strip trials and these other things if you know what you're doing and you know what you're measuring and you know what to expect. But yeah, I mean, feeding more microbial critters with crop residues is probably the way to go, as long as you're not throwing too much toxic sort of ag chemicals in there that might knock those microbes on the head. It's always going to be a trade-off. If you're really after the biology, some of the chemistry is going to have to be in that consideration.
Yeah, and an observation, maybe say 18 months ago, say in our place where it was stubble retention for 20 years.
Yep.
Versus a neighbour that's been on and off for the last 10 or 15.
Mm.
After the wet summer, his stubble was in better health, as in standing, so the root structure was better there. Would that be fair to assume because of poorer soil health, less microbes eating that?
It's one possible cause, yeah. The photos I showed you of the stuff that had fallen over and the stuff that hadn't and the different heights, any paddock where someone's done their first setup paddock for stripping cereals, where you'll have different heights. I went around to a few, and others didn't have that. Whether their soil wasn't as biologically active, whether the soil moisture conditions weren't wet enough, there's all sorts of variables that'll change that. The old stubble pull test is a good one just to see. I was trying to work out how you could actually measure that properly, as how much force required, but no, a bit hard. But yeah, moisture as much as the condition of the soil to start with, I think is in the mix. And some soil types are probably just less able to support that sort of faster rate of turnover.
Very good. We'll have to wrap it up now, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Chris. It's good
Thank
to see some, just a token of appreciation, good
Thank
to
you.
see some data validating what